Hi Guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lorfarius, and for this week we will be taking a deep dive into micro machines. But before we just do that, I've got a bit of news for myself. It's not really Amiga related. I have been playing so many retro games lately, not just Amiga stuff, but various different consoles, and I've been looking at things like other handhelds and maybe picking up the odd system or two along the way. And one thing that always comes across when I'm going through each of these is just how expensive retro gaming is becoming these days. I mean, just this is aside from the Amiga equipment, which is a £300 or £400 investment if you want to get into the original system. And I've been drifting more and more towards actually playing emulation for some of the older stuff I really want to go back to. In particular, something like Chrono Trigger. I've never really played that over on the Super Nintendo. I've heard it's very, very good, and I started thinking about it. Ended up picking up a SNES Mini and trying it out for a bit, which was great. And then at the same time, I got a retro handheld system which I could load up with emulators and play in bed and carry it around with me and things like that. The screen wasn't too big or expensive or anything major. It was okay, it did the job, but then I started thinking more and more, what if I was to get some sort of big emulation box? That sent me down the route of getting like an arcade machine. You can see where this is going, and before I knew it, I'd picked something up with 20-inch screen, proper joysticks and all like the marquee and the surround and stuff. I've been talking about this in the Discus room. I'll be posting pictures and stuff too, so if you want to pop along to there, just have a look in the show notes as usual. I think it's well worth having a look at, and I'm sort of spreading out into more retro, but at the same time I'm an odd one. It probably won't stop me from going back to the original kit because I really like my retro games. What can I say? Moving on to some Amiga news. Yes, there is some coming. First up, I saw this over on Indie Retro News the other day, and it's the unofficial CD32 release of point and click adventure games. Start with Simon the Sorcerer and more. There's a bit of blurb here. A collection of 86, bloody hell, point and click adventure games with all the classics released for the Amiga on here, along with some nice previously unreleased games like English versions of Teen Agent and Inherit the Earth, which is the full English talkie version on the disc. I think that was a German only game at the time. And also the unreleased full game of In Shadow of Time. You can find that over on cd32covers.blogspot.com. There's a massive link there. I will stick that into the show notes. I am a huge graphic adventure fan. Something like this is ideal for me. Just a shame I've not got a CD32 yet. I've been half on and off in about playing through the Space Quest series. They do take a lot of time to go through. Not enough, I don't think, to put into a weekly show on a regular basis, so I don't think I'll ever do a few of those in a row or anything. And I'm not too sure how point and clicks come across, because beyond talking about the story and some of the basics of the graphics, I suppose it'll be okay with some of the history. I've sort of covered them in the past. I've been steering clear because I've been a bit worried how you guys would come across with them, but if you would like me to talk more about these games and to cover more of them, by all means drop me a line or something on the comments somewhere and I'll see what I can do. Recently, there was something called the Deadline Demo Party over in Berlin, Germany. Now, all of the results from this are held on Pouet.net, that's Pouet.net, and they had about 40 songs on there. I've been digging through a few of these. They can all be downloaded and played on an actual Amiga, but thankfully a load of these have been uploaded to YouTube, and the winner of this, which was called Lemonade, sounds absolutely fantastic. It's that 90s sort of hardcore, is it garage beat or jungle or something like that? I know nothing about music, but it sounds ace, and it's the sort of stuff as Amiga fans we should be supporting. It's fantastic that people are still going back to this system and being able to make this sort of thing. So yeah, follow the link or just listen to what I said before and go and check it out. that's a bit of a short little ditty for the Amiga. There really wasn't much to put in, I'm afraid, and that's the best we can do. We are of course going to be looking at Micro Machines this week. Now this is a game series, I suppose, that's rather close to my heart, especially for the multiplayer aspects, and maybe not so much on the Amiga, certainly by the Mega Drive and the sequel with the it had like a really special cartridge which had 2 extra joypad ports on top. I've never even seen or heard of anything like that at the time, but it would let you play with 4 players at once, which was unheard of on the, especially on a Sega system like that. I mean, even on the Super Nintendo, I suspect you'd be looking at something like the N64 by the time that even became a regular thing. For years though, we would always be playing these games with a group of friends, having a laugh and a bit of fun, and I do remember getting to play the Amiga version quite on and off for several years. I think it was a single floppy disk, so it was quite a draw and one you could just stick in a back pocket and take around at a mate or two's house just to have a bit of fun with. The publisher / developer was Codemasters. This wasn't farmed out to anybody else. They were huge budget publishers back in the 80s across all manner of different systems, and the Amiga was certainly something new to them. It was a strange point when they were trying to diverge away onto consoles, and I think computers were sort of on the back burner, but they did convert all of the Dizzy games, or I think most of them. I think Fantasy World Dizzy comes to mind. I'm just completely going off memory here. Treasure Island Dizzy, definitely. I think Magic Land Dizzy, or is it Prince of the Yoke Folk? I should have probably looked into that. I just saw a huge list of Dizzy games listed next to them for the Amiga. I should have gone a bit deeper. Something called Violator, I have no idea what that is. It sounds like an awesome game. And Cosmic Spacehead. Now, I wasn't a big fan of that one, I'm afraid to say. I mean, I did actually buy that full price on it was the Mega Drive, and it was something I played on and off for a while, but I never really got into it. But as I said, they were really driving towards consoles around this area. They would try to get into like the NES market over in the US, and would try to bring a way of getting the games across the seas to, I suppose, appeal to that mass market over there. Because if you think about something like in the UK, the Amiga market at the time was probably 100,000, 200,000 games was classed as a big hit. But if you think about something, say Super Mario Brothers, which was hitting millions over there, a lot of the games could get to that sort of amount sold across the whole of the US. So you just needed one big hit to make the day over there and take off in a huge way, and they did try for umpteen years. That'll be going up into the NES history, so we'll leave it there for now. Micro Machines was released in 1993. As I said before, it came on just 1 floppy disk, and it was for 2 players. Coming in at the grand old price of £25.99. This was definitely a full price title. Now, the coder behind the game was Charlie Skilbeck. Now, he had done games like Super Grand Prix on the Amiga, Sky High. More modern areas related to things like Crisis, the Battlefield games. I think number 4 was one of his. He also did the graphics. Now, I couldn't find many details about this, and I was trying to look through different articles and magazines, and you do the usual way you're raiding the online databases, but the best I could get for this was that Codemasters did the coding, the graphics and all the bits, and it's just like, the actual people who worked there. And when you actually play the game, it doesn't even mention them. It says everything was done by Codemasters, which is a bit sad really, and there was no sort of cheat with showing like a hidden credits list or people that had been involved. So I was really annoyed by that because it doesn't give me much to spill out onto, but luckily I was able to go onto Twitter and asked Charlie some basic questions. He did confirm who was involved and what happened, and I'm afraid I didn't get any sort of interview or anything deeper than that, but it's great that you can still go back to the people these days and they will talk back through the history if you give them chance to. It's also another AMIGArama first, as it's another game that we've managed to confirm further details on that nobody else knew before. Yes, this show does have its uses. The music in the game was done by Matthew Simmons. He was responsible for all of the Dizzy games, Chuck Rock, UFO, Enemy Unknown, XCOM, Agony, that's a belter for tunes, Last Battle, loads and loads of different titles. He was all over the Amiga game scene. The Amiga game is actually a port of the original NES title, or NES if you like that sort of thing. It was completely designed for that system. It was for the American market, and then it was ported back to multiple systems. And the thing is, every time they ported it to a different one, depending on the age of the system they were putting it on, because you had like the 8-bit and the 16-bit generations, they would make enhancements like graphics, maybe sound effects, bit of music, things like that. They didn't seem to have done much with the music on the Amiga version, sadly, but the fact is they did make the attempt to appeal to different markets. A chap called Andrew Graham designed the original game, with it being one of Codemaster's earliest full-price titles. Now, up until this point, I said before, they were focused mainly on budget games, and they wanted something to make it big over in the US and spill out into other countries and markets, I'm sure. So their push for this was not just to come out with this simple, nice, cheap throwaway title, say for about £10 or £15. They wanted to go full hog and really pulled out all the stops for micro machines. Andrew actually took out a whole year from university to code the game. That's a UK university, by the way, not in the US. He had never even seen an NES before. This was his first time actually using one. And he had coding experience elsewhere. They didn't just throw this at him willy-nilly. And he was given a Commodore 64, which was connected to a PC. And then in turn there was an NES thrown into the mix just to make it all work. I'm not even sure how cross-porting works, but it sounds absolutely incredible. Just how many systems can they use at once, just daisy chaining them all along. It sort of reminds me of the Mega Drive and the Mega CD and the 32X, and then the power converter adapter thing for the Master. Oh my god, that thing was absolutely terrifying. But I suppose on developers front it's exactly the same. You have to have all these different tools and graphics tools and all the rest of it just to make the base code to work with everything else. In an interview, he said that the racing arcade game Power Drift was a huge inspiration, and he had actually been working on a single track racing game called California Boogie Boys. That's a bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? Now, this was a very simple game, like with this one track. You had to just race to the edge of the screen, beat your opponent, and you would win. There was nothing really more complicated to it than that. The Darling brothers saw this in the studio when he was just testing and messing around with it, and then came up with the idea is, let's try and convert the work that's been done with this game into micro machines, because they just recently obtained the license. They wanted something meaty they could dig their mitts in to come up with some sort of franchise, and this seems the best way to do it, because what do you think of when you think of micro machines? Racing games, cars flying around tracks and places and play areas, you know, nice and simple. It was also a huge US brand of toys. It was doing extremely well, and all I can think is they were sat there going, oh, just imagine the amount of cash flow we could get off the back of this if it's a hit. I mean, toys do sell games, and a sort of vice versa in a way, depending on the title, especially back then. The size of the actual toys and vehicles made the ideal match for household environments. You know, these are kids running around with these little tiny tinky toys, and from what they said in interviews, the actual track design just came naturally as they were looking around for big things for them to drive around, and it's just like, oh, we'll just base them around a house because that's the simplest things to do. And thinking back, it really wasn't a popular idea at the time. No one, I don't think, had ever really approached it to that degree. Maybe something like Simant had been that close down and looking close, but there wasn't racing games, I don't think, that digged into this environment of swinging around a house or a backyard, and it really is an original concept. Although the original development wasn't actually done on an Amiga, it was done with deluxe paint for the graphics, which did astound me really, and they mixed that with a compiler program that one of them wrote, and then added that via a PC card which was linked over to the Amiga to do the conversion, and some jiggery pokery, I'm sure. How many systems were involved in making this one game? Should be on about 15 floppy disks from the amount of stuff I've been finding out about it. Right from the off, the game was designed to be in multiplayer. It was meant for lots of different people to play. The single player, sadly, did take a bit of a bite because they never really meant that to be the main draw concept of it, so it was sort of stuck on and glued on at the end. They did do the best that they could with the idea, but by their own admission, it came in at second best. They really wanted this to be for multiple players. And you can see this because it's got up to 4 cars on the screen at once, even though it's only a 2-player game, except in a later version. It wasn't really possible to program that amount of AI into a track, so it just sort of got put on the back burner and left behind. But they did say that they tried the best with it and tried to put as much into the single player version as they could. The AI really wasn't very complicated. The cars just followed invisible arrows. If they skidded off the road or were knocked out of the pattern, the arrows would just guide them back onto the main road. They'd just jump back on and carry on. That's about as complicated as it got. But it does give you the impression that there is some intelligence at times, because they don't always seem to be on a set pattern all the time, and it's a mix of really when you get pushed off, it seems like they are driving properly, but it doesn't really work as good as it should really. The game was a critical success for Codemasters on all systems that it came out of, and financially they made a great deal of money from it. I couldn't actually find any sales figures or actual totals, but they were very pleased from different comments that they'd written. It must have been very popular because they ended up doing a load of sequels. These spanned several generations, and they got as far as 3 games in the series and dabbled on later systems, I think maybe on the Xbox, which came out under a different name, or they were attempting one. I think that was cancelled. By the end, they were even dabbling in 3D and switching away from the top-down 2D races. They really were trying everything with this to make it into a serious franchise which lasted for years and years. The second game even had Violet Berlin starring within the game as one of the playable characters, and she was on TV's Bad Influence programme on the ITV station, if you're not aware of what that is, or if you're outside of the UK, and she was even interviewed about it on the show. Finally, it was ported to the NES, the Super Nintendo, PC or DOS, Sega, Game Gear, Master System, Mega Drive, Genesis, and the very interesting one, the CDI. I'm not sure if that had a proper controller or if it was a TV remote. I might be thinking of a different one of those systems. Either way, for something like that, seems a bit of a stretch for an action game. I'm afraid with this being a racing game, there is no story to speak of. I was sort of hoping this might be a bit like Toy Commander over on the Sega Dreamcast, where you've got the kid running around the house and driving the vehicles by hand, and God, that was an amazing game. I've forgotten about that. I played that at launch. I think it was that fantastic, but there's nothing like that in Micro Machines. You're just straight in there with your cars driving around the house, and that's as complicated as it gets. When you first start the game, you're not shown anything fancy. This is a top-down 2D racer. It's not more complicated than that. You get to see a section of track which surrounds you. It doesn't go off for miles and miles. The camera is actually quite close to you. Now, the very first level, as far as I'm aware, it's always a bathtub, and you're surrounded by lots and lots of bubbles and oodles of water. There's no legs or naughty bits sticking out, I'm glad to say. There's also it's almost like a metal or plastic holder that runs across the top of the bath. I've not seen one of these for years, but it holds things like soap and shampoo bottles, and you can actually see a bottle of shampoo right across the start off to the side. It's not an amazing graphic, but it does add to the atmosphere and it creates the look well. And even though the actual bath is quite huge because you're driving around a fair old distance in there, it never feels like it's too big. You're within enough of an enclosed space that it feels quite compact, but enough for you to explore at the same time. Along the bottom of the screen is a huge grey bar which shows the number of laps that you need to complete. This isn't just in numbers, it actually says laps to complete. There's also racer position. This is a bit of an odd that. Rather than just showing your number, it shows a number of coloured helmets which match the colour of the vehicle, so red, green, etc. Now, as you move around through the race and you get in different positions, they flick back and forth, and it's not the greatest looking thing, and it can be a bit confusing when you just try to quickly glimpse down to it to work out what position you're in. Most of the time it's not an issue because the cars tend to stick quite close together and you don't really need to look at that, but it is a bit of a distraction off at the bottom, and I would have preferred it just to say like first, second, third, fourth, and leave it at that, because you don't really need to know where everyone else is. But then again, what am I saying? Because I suppose if you're in 2-player, maybe you need something a bit more complicated. The game does use 2 buttons, which was quite pleasing. One of which is nice and simple, it just accelerates the car. The other will fire a weapon if the vehicle has got one on top, but the only one that does is the tank, which is much further in the race courses. You don't play that right from the off, and even then it's nothing amazing, it's just firing a few bullets out in front of the car. If they hit people, they will blow up. But that doesn't transform the game into like a battle royale where you're all facing off against each other. It's really simple. It's just a case of if anyone gets in front of you, you can fire at them a couple of times to take them out, and vice versa. So you've really got to be careful how you would position that tank to fire at people. It's very basic. There isn't any sort of brake. I don't think you really need it. The cars do turn quite well on the spot. Hitting left and right will guide them off to either side. It controls really well, I'm happy to say. Everything turns quite quickly, and you never feel like you're in a situation where the controls are to blame. They really have hit the spot with these. Across the game, there is 24 courses with 8 types of levels. These range from the bathtub, which I've mentioned, the snooker table, that sounds as awesome as you can probably imagine, garage floor, greenhouse, school desk, sandpit, kitchen, and even a tabletop. There are a total of 11 characters to choose from, but they don't really make any difference. Everyone is the same to drive. It doesn't affect the vehicles or the cars. And on the racetrack themselves, there are a huge number of different objects to drive around, drive over. They're almost ornamental in a way. You've got things like shovels, snooker balls in the obvious place, flowers, soaps, beans, glue, nails, pencils, pretty much anything you can think of in a household is dotted around these tracks. The tracks themselves are all drawn out on either chalk or sand, and they all match the environment which you're within, so you never get too confused or put off by the type of track that you're actually on. It's always easy to work out which way you need to go. The objects are quite strange. Some of them will just slow you down. Things like the beans and the glue, they don't actually move, you just drive over them, but your speed will just disappear. But then if you hit a thing like a nail, you can just either stop dead or bounce off in a direction. One of the greatest things you can do is bounce into a snooker ball. Again, none of these things move, they're just static graphics, almost like a border. But the snooker balls and direction, they fire you off in a set direction. You really do bounce off, and if you've got a bit of speed, you can use that to your advantage, because there's a few of them that will be lined up in almost like a column, and the track goes right through the middle, this very narrow gap. And if you time it right, you can bounce off one before them and sort of slide through the middle and knock other people out of the way and just cause all sorts of damage. The obstacles are really planted well, and it really does add to the game environment as you're exploring all these different areas. The level of detail on the items, the track and the graphics are fantastic. None of these environments look a bit off or look strange. They do actually look like parts of a house, and each area matches what it should be. There's loads of detail in there, and they're bright and they're colourful, and even mixed in with the way the cars are, they always tend to match the colour of your helmet, which is a bit simple. The snooker table in particular is really impressive. You've got things like playing cards which are flat on the table, or they might be against one of the edges. You can drive up and over them, and there's loads of different colour of the cards and the suits, and you'll see the back of the cards. I'm going on about these cards an awful lot. A snooker cue that goes right across the table. Even in the garage with the things like the nails across like the metallic floor and the drops of glue. The glue is clear with a little bit of reflection on. Tons and tons of detail, and it really does show that they've put some effort into convincing you that you're actually in these environments. The tracks themselves are very sharp and can be very tricky, with loads of obstacles laid to trick you or send you off down the wrong path. Of course, like with racing games, you get to learn the way they are, but at first, when you're first exploring and taking your time to get around areas and stuff, there's a few like side paths and things that push you off in a certain direction, depending on the type of game you play, because there's like 2 sort of modes to it. There's one where you're racing ahead to get in front of the other person, you get too far, you win a point, and the other one is nice simple race where you slap bang in the middle of everybody, you try to get into first place. That's nice and simple. but you do need to stay close to the track middles. You really do need to be on course for most of the times, and the way that they slide around corners, a lot of these are drawn onto the environments, like on top of a table and so on, and you've got things like rulers and chalk drawing the lines out, and it really can be tricky to get around some of these corners and past certain sections. What's a racing game like this without piles and piles of different vehicles? You've got loads included in this. You've got F1 cars, tanks, normal cars, racing cars, helicopters, speedboats. I'm sure I've missed a load just trying to list them off the top of my head there, but the fact is, all these vehicles drive differently. They all feel very, very different. The F1 car is probably by far the fastest in the game, but something like the tank is slow and plodding, and yes, it's got a weapon on top, and it makes for a different type of race. Sadly, all of the cars within each race, they're all limited to the current one that you're in. So if you've got an F1 car, everyone else has got an F1 car. If you've got a tank, everyone else has. It has 2 game modes. One of these, as I said before, is head to head. You do get to race up to 4 other vehicles in that. And challenge mode. Now these are very, very simplistic. It's things like get far ahead of the other car, beat a track in a certain time. Nothing that's really too taxing, and this one does feel like a bit of an add-on extra mode. It's nothing too amazing. The main aim of challenge mode though is to collect as many micro machines as possible. You get presented with a screen of a big yellow plastic house. I suppose this is like one of the models in real life, and every time you complete a challenge mode you get one of the little cars, and you can actually see that appear inside this little house, and when you've got a full set, nothing really happens, but it's exciting to think that you're building towards something. But sadly, you could spend ages doing all these and getting through them, but there is no save mode, and so you can't keep that. You don't get to keep any of your times. Now this is a pure racing game. There are no items to collect through any of the races. They could have added loads of those, I suppose, to add some variety, especially when you've got things like the tank and the cannon. I bet it would have been nice to just have a little bit extra. You're pretty much stuck with racing, and it doesn't get any deeper than that. Again, this is a single disc game, so I don't suspect they were planning on doing anything more taxing than simple racing. The game does have title screen music, as you heard earlier, but that's about it, I'm afraid to say. There's nothing really amazing about that tune. It's a nice little ditty. There's also a few of them dotted between levels and stuff, almost like celebration music, but these aren't big, like 4, 5, 6 minute long tracks, just a little ditty and then off you go. Bit sad, I suppose, on the music front. It is filled with an average mix of sound effects, and you get things like the engine noise, some skidding and clashes and things when you bounce off, but nothing like really involving or clashing of motors or engines or anything like that. There's no like huge soundscape to explore or listen to. This is pretty basic, and it does come across like that when you're playing. The main game originally was supposed to be about the multiplayer, and this does show if you play this with 2 people, because you're not relying on the AI as much to have your fun. You're relying on the skill and the effort of another person to get around the tracks, and that's really where the game can shine, because it can be very challenging, or it can be just as boring as playing against the computer people. I suppose it depends on who you're playing against. Now the computer players do remain in the background of the track whilst you're having these 2-player matches, depending on the type you've picked. Now they don't really do much beyond provide a bit of background noise and kerfuffles as you're driving along. It all becomes focused on racing against the other person. That AI doesn't really drive them to do anything really serious. They're okay, they're passable, I suppose. It makes the game a bit more fun. We are at the part of the show where we need to talk through some of its problems. First of all, there is no parallax scrolling. Again, this is the Amiga. It can quite easily do this. It's a very easy effect, and what it would have done is like things like when you're driving around the tabletops or the exam table, the floors in the background, it's all like set shapes and designs. It's not moving differently to say like the desk that you're on top of, so it doesn't give you a good sense of actually moving around an environment. You don't see too many of them. They're not like straight in your face all the time, but it's just a nice little easy touch they could have done. I mean, you've got to remember this is the Amiga, and as you know from our Shadow of the Beast special, the Amiga is very, very capable of doing all these fancy scrolling effects, and this game game just doesn't go out of its way to do anything with it, and it's just a bit disappointing. As I said before, there's only 2 game modes, head-to-head and challenge mode. This is very, very strange to me, especially for a racer. I mean, this is like the early 90s when Mario Kart and racing like F-Zero and stuff on the consoles, these were becoming a big thing. And there's nothing to this game whatsoever. Now bear in mind that Codemasters was supposed to be making more than a budget title, and it feels like they've shortchanged you a bit with this. It could have done with something like a League or a Mario Kart style cut with the challenges mixed in, and maybe you have to win positions in racing. They could have done lots and lots of different things with it. The one player was, by their own admission, an afterthought. You know, they tried the best with it, but they did just stick it on, and it does show. But it seems weird really, because for the sake of programming a few tables and extra menus, that's not very complicated for an Amiga game. They could have done a lot more with it, and again, it just disappoints me. There's a lot going on with this game. It is a good game, but it's got these are pretty glaring issues. When you're driving around the tracks and you see things like the snooker balls or objects, they've got like these really neat shadows, and it seems very, very bizarre that when you're driving around with the different vehicles, if you go over a little jump or a bump in the road, your vehicle will actually lift up in the air and you will see a round shadow underneath. It seems a bit odd that they didn't make any sort of effort to show the shadow of the vehicle. I don't know if that's really, really difficult, but the fact that they've got a circle shape there and all the vehicles, maybe it just added too much work, and it just seems a bit lazy. The biggest issue though is the computer AI, especially in single player, because they do stick to that set pattern in the middle, and I know they're following the arrows and guiding it along, and it can be fun when they're knocked off to the side, but the thing is, in the one player game, it's very, very easy to learn their patterns because each car will sort of stick to it in the same-ish area, so you can avoid it, and once you get ahead, you go flying on out of the way, and there's very little chance of them actually catching up, and a few of the vehicles are a lot faster than the computer players, so it's difficult to find much of a challenge with that AI there. I did really like the yellow house and the collecting the cars, but the thing is, that's all linked to the challenge mode. It feels a bit pointless. There's no other rewards for doing the challenges. There's no like hidden cars or extra tracks to unlock, and again, they could have opened that a bit more. You've got so many courses. They could have, say, locked away 2 or 3, and then you had to complete certain challenges and then unlock these courses later on within the game, but there's just nothing like that, and it just leaves you a bit disappointed with the challenge mode on the whole. There is no in-game music whatsoever. That does feel like a real shame, because if you think of something like Mario Kart with the music turned off, it's a bit boring. Yes, you've got the action on the screen, but you want a lot going on. There can be very, very frantic points, even in this game, and you want that bit of a oomph to push you through and get a bit excited, but it's just dead quiet. There's nothing going on beyond the sound effects, and the sound effects aren't amazing whatsoever, so there's no sort of musical atmosphere. There's nothing driving you through the races. They should have done a lot more for that. And another thing before we move on, I had next to no problem with any of the vehicles. Most of them were great. I really, really enjoyed them. The one that stood out as being a bit disappointing was the tank and the tank sections. Now, the tank firing a cannon, it's not amazing, it's just a little bit. It's almost like firing a pea shooter with a couple of shots to take someone out. It's a bit of fun. I've not said this before, you can damage the other cars. There's no sort of energy bars though, so it's pretty hit or miss, because sometimes you can hit them once or twice and they'll blow up. Other times they can hit a wall and blow up, and then another time they can go crashing into the same wall, get hit by something else, and nothing will happen. So it's a bit mix and match, but it's very easy to dodge. I just think it could have done with more tank sections or a few more improvements, and that also ties into the lack of items. Again, comparing this to Mario Kart, and that's probably not fair because they are very different types of games. I would have liked some sort of option of extra weapons, because it's teasing us in a way to give us the fire from the cannon, which shows that the vehicles can do something else, and then not let you collect any sort of speed boost or jump or any sort of fancy item or anything. It would have added a whole other element to the racing. I'm not sure why they didn't. Maybe it just didn't occur at the time. I don't think Mario Kart or anything like that was really out at this point, but it seems like they were almost there with the tank bullets, but they just didn't go the extra mile to clock onto that idea. It's time to have a look at the magazine scores. Amiga Format offered 90%. Ooh. CU Amiga gave it 89%. The One, 89 as well. Amiga Power, 88%, Amiga Action, 83%, and lastly, Amiga Computing gave it 80%. Now, going off these scores, this sounds like an absolutely amazing, fantastic game, especially compared to other races, I suppose. And I get the impression, though, from my playing through of this, it's not that sort of level of game. For me personally, I think this is a 7 or 8 out of 10. I can see why it's got great scores in a way and hints at it, and I suspect going off this that these guys were only focusing on the multiplayer, because it would have been great to play this with like other people in an office, because you're playing over a couple of days, you know, and having a bit of fun with other people. But if you're sat at home playing this single player, which most people at the time would have been doing, it seems that they haven't dug into this properly. It's the only way to me that I can justify these as proper scores. On the whole, this really doesn't feel like a budget game. You know, there's an awful lot of fun to be had, especially when it comes down to the multiplayer. There is a lot of challenge in there. There's a good amount of courses. I've never sat really with a racing game before and thought, yeah, there's enough tracks there. You do feel that with this, you know, 24 courses split over between the two packages. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of value there, especially for a single floppy disk. The single player, though, it just doesn't do enough. There isn't enough of a game there to be doing on a regular basis. You can have a bit of fun with it, I suppose, in short bursts, and it's okay to go back to, but without another person there to drive you on, to provide enough of a challenge, the AI is too limited really. It's not great enough to be pushing you or challenging you in any sort of serious way. I mean, it's a shame because there are some really good looking racing tracks in there, and for the time it must have felt like actually being in a house and racing around the different environments and having a bit of fun. It matches the look perfectly. The environment of like the desk or the kitchen counter with all the different items on, and my favourite track, which was the one racing around the snooker cues and the snooker balls and stuff, and driving into the snooker pockets and then coming out almost in a warp somewhere else. Very, very exciting and odd way to play a game, and for the time it would have just blown people away. The handling as well is absolutely fantastic. Not many racing games reach this level of accuracy and fun control, and most of the other ones tend to be very average games. There are real like hairpin bend moments where you're swerving around like these snooker balls, or you're stuck in corners, and again, I keep going on about the snooker tables, but I had a real lot of fun in them. There's just not enough of those sections or courses to be racing around in. For the single player, it's crying out for other modes. It just feels like they need to put more in there. They need to make a bit more effort and just add some extra things to do for the single player. It's just very disappointing. It feels like this game sets them up perfectly for a sequel. The racing engine is there, they've got the ideas, they just need to stretch it out a bit more and do some more things here, there and everywhere, and I can understand why after it being such a success they came back to it. I'm a huge fan of the Sega Mega Drive edition. It was the one I played a lot growing up, but this just isn't quite there. It's got the handling, it's got the tracks, it hasn't got the modes. Sadly, it's almost there, but no cigar. Sadly, it's time to draw the show to a close. If you've any comments on what you've heard today, you can pop along to AMIGArama.com, drop me a line on Lorfarius at AMIGArama.com, or even come to the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AMIGArama. Of course, we are on Discuss and Twitter, which is at AMIGAramaPod. I almost forgot what that was then. And I would just like to take a moment to thank all of our Patreon supporters. They are still with the show, thankfully, and helping to keep the lights on. They are Adam Bradley, Figgy CTZ, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford, who does the Casual Retro Gamer weekly show, Jason Warnes, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, they have a site with the same name, Retro Ravi, Richard Legg, Sneff and Treble. Again, a big thank you to these guys, they help keep the show going. Anyway, until next time guys.